Once upon a time. Welcome to Australian Book Lovers, your destination for imagination.
A huge warm welcome to everybody, and an even huger thank you for joining us for the Australian Book Lovers podcast. Our mission, as always, is to bring fabulous Australian and Indigenous literature spanning a whole range of genres to book lovers all around the globe, as well as fantastic resources and information for passionate authors looking to write their next bestseller. I am Darren Kazenko, science fiction and horror author, reader, and one of your hosts and co-founder of Australian Book Lovers, coming to you today from Corner Country.
And I'm Veronica Strachan, fantasy, memoir and picture book writer, reader, and your other co-founder and host. Really thrilled today to bring you, it's a fantastic industry special.
Yes.
That deals with both reading and writing.
Episode number 23.
It is episode number 23, yes. And this is such a serendipitous episode, I guess. I saw on Twitter a photo of two of the books of authors that we have on the Australian Book Lovers. I saw Peter Lyre's Rating Normal by Anna Whateley and The Boy from the Mish by Gary Lonesborough. People who are listening to the backlist would have heard Gary's episode, and we do have a chat with Anna recorded for a little bit later. But I saw this, I thought, what are they up to, those two? And it was a tweet by Dr Annika Herb. She's a sessional academic, learning designer. She's a doctor, so her PhD is in English and writing for the University of Newcastle. So she was mentioning a project. They were recruiting for this project, recruiting readers, Seeing the Self, examining reader experience of queer representation in young adult literature. And what they were trying to do was to interrogate the impact of the visibility of queer representation in YA for young readers. So they wanted to know if readers could see themselves, and they wanted to explore other experiences, outside their own, and look at intersectional representation, which I ask a little bit about in the session, and then what sort of narratives or representations they experienced in their reading and what they would like to see, amongst other things. So we talk about it in the session, they're going to explore monthly focus groups, and they have a kind of a book club format, and the participants read and discuss the text, and really thrilled that they were trying to emphasise an Australian perspective. So half their chosen texts were Australian YA fiction, hence Anna's book and Gary's book were there. So that was, really good. I approached her, said, hey, we should interview you on the podcast. She said she'd love to, and that was the end of it.
Yeah, what a beautiful way to get such a great host, just to go out there and ask, and it just goes to show you can't get anything without asking. And wow, we were so lucky to be able to have that chat.
It was fascinating, and I think it gives another dimension to the whole reading and writing and publishing industry, is that there are so many ways you can contribute to it. So, writers don't just contribute to a single person reading their story. And I know when we talk with Anna, we'll hear some of the great feedback from her readers. And I know even when we talked to Gary, there were some readers who said they was just so pleased to have seen themselves in fiction. Not many people, Gary said when he was young, he hadn't seen a queer Aboriginal character in a story. So, he always had to kind of look elsewhere, and it's really gratifying to see that. So readers, read the books, keep your eye out for this kind of research, and, volunteer for that, and lots of opportunities to contribute to learning and design, teaching, innovation, reading, publishing.
Yeah, well, it was one thing I took out of the conversation with Annika was just how important readers are, and how the love that they have for literature, and to see certain aspects in literature helps shape the art form itself, which is so it's a very very symbiotic relationship, I think, between the writers and the readers. But ultimately, I think the power of the readership will slowly becoming a powerful force that's moving the publishing industry as well. Yeah, so that's definitely something I took from it. And what an astounding talker. I mean, it puts my vernacular, makes it look pedestrian, even on a good day. I mean, I stumble on the best of days, but wow, such a beautiful speaker, and
she was really lovely to chat with
clear.
you. So passionate about her work too. Yeah, and she has also, let me know, just sort of, touching base before we get ready to publish the episode, that the research is going really well. So they're about to have their third session with the participants, and the participants are really enthusiastic and passionate about the topic. They've been getting lots of interesting findings and really how it's impacted people's identities as young adult readers. And she also said there's been significant interest in accessing more queer Australian YA literature. So there is she's, I'm quoting Annika on this, a ready and eager market. So if you are out there writing queer Australian YA literature, get busy, because
definitely.
You've got readers waiting for you.
And again, another thing I took from the conversation was just that growing sentiment for own voices and that ability to find, writers or find really good stories, especially Australian stories, being that we're Australian, where you can see yourself in one of the characters. And
Yeah.
Which makes, of course, the reading a whole more magical experience.
It absolutely does. And it's interesting, I've just been attending a course by the Australian Society of Authors, who we'll be talking to in a few more episodes. But this particular session that I was at was talking about what, film and TV producers are looking for in books. And one of the things that was mentioned was that this was from a woman called Alex Adset, who's a great literary a book agent, but she also does a whole stack of work just within the community. I know she does work with the Australian Society of Authors as well. But actually, I don't know whether it was her or whether it was Jodie, the lady who was... Anyway, somebody mentioned that the things film producers are looking for is stuff that is relatable, but it's familiar. So even in film and television, people want to be able to see that could be them, or they've been a part of that, or it kind of reflects a part of what their life is. So, long story short, they want to see themselves in film and on the telly too.
Well, there's definitely more chance of seeing yourself in a film or something along that lines than you will in reality TV, because I don't think there's much reality in reality TV.
Yeah, maybe not reality TV, but, I'm more in, fictional TV.
Yes.
Yeah,
but nonetheless,
so there you go.
Yes, I mean, so many things to talk about, but obviously that's just the power of the conversation that we had with Annika. She really brings a passion to a subject which is, obviously something that's very close to her heart, and is touching on a whole lot of aspects that are gaining momentum out there in the literary world and the community at large. So I'm sure, listeners, you're going to really enjoy this conversation, and you're probably going to have a whole heap of things to think about as well, just like I have, since having the pleasure to be a part of the conversation.
Okay, over to Annika.
Yes, indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for another super fun industry edition of our Australian Book Lovers podcast. And without further ado, the wonderful, the awesome, the vernacular superstar with a passion for all things words, Annika Herb.
And welcome, listeners, to an Australian Book Lovers podcast, our very first academic podcast. And we have with us Dr Annika Herb, who is a learning designer from the University of Newcastle. Welcome, Annika.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Very good. And of course, I forgot to introduce myself. This is Veronica Strachan, and I am one of the founders and co-hosts for today. I'm coming to you today from Warriorung Country, Wurundjeri, part of the Kulin Nation in Victoria. And I have my co-host.
Absolutely. You have your co-host. I am Darren Kazanko, and I'm coming to you from Corner Country today. And it is an absolute pleasure to have you on board, Dr. Annika Herb. Of course, we've got lots of questions for you, and some probably silly ones coming from my way, so you're allowed to just ignore those. But no, thank you so much for being a part of the podcast and taking your time out. Really looking forward to hearing what you have to educate us on, because I know that there's plenty there for us to learn from.
No problem. I'm always very happy to talk about this and am actually quite hard to rein in. So
okay.
looking forward to chatting about it.
Excellent. So a light hand on the rein. So Annika, where are you coming from today? Who are the traditional owners of the land where you live and work?
Yes, so I'm speaking from beautiful Awabakal land, the traditional custodians of which are the Pambalong clan, particularly for the University of Newcastle, for our Callaghan campus, if we venture a bit further, or over in Arimba, so slightly different owners there.
Excellent. And we've discussed that it's a really cold day up here and everyone is a bit freezing. So we're getting into some really warm and fabulous conversation. So just for the listeners, I wanted to let you know, I spotted a tweet from Annika. And the reason I spotted it was because it had the images of The Boy from the Mish by Gary Lonesborough and Peter Lyre's Rating Normal by Anna Waitley, both of whom are authors, are both on our website. Gary was our very first podcast, and Anna, we've recorded a podcast. She hasn't come up as yet, but we're getting there. And Anna is a colleague from one of the early writers groups on Twitter. So I know her, and I've read both of those books. And I thought, what is this? Who's celebrating these fabulous works? And Annika's tweet was, very excited to be starting on our research project on reader experience of queer identity and representation on young adult literature. So will you look at these beautiful books ready to be devoured? And I thought, I need to get in on that. What is happening? So Annika, tell us a little bit, if you would, about your research.
Yeah, absolutely. So over at the University of Newcastle, I'm a sessional academic there in English and creative writing and some of the humanities projects. And my background and my PhD is all in young adult literature, and in particular female sexuality, gender identity, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I've been recently really expanding into queer YA, which is just a huge passion project for me. I'm deeply in love with it all. So I'm really just, continuing down this path of going, well, what can I research and sort of be paid to do that I care about so much, and it just feels like a dream job, which is queer YA, and in particular too, trying to bring in a lot of Australian books. So this project came about. I spoke to my co-researcher on the project, who's in social work as his background, Dr. David Betts.
Mm-hmm.
So wanted to also, because I thought it'd be good fun to do this research with a friend.
Mm-hmm.
So this project is looking at, we've basically got a whole bunch of focus groups. We're asking young adults, and in this case, we've got 18-year-olds to 30-year-olds. We'd love to expand down the track to, let's say, more actual young adults with teenagers, but that's a matter of ethics, so we'll look into that down the track. Of asking their experience, particularly if they identify as queer in some capacity or LGBTQIA+, with accessing representations of the self, with being able to see themselves in novels. So we've got a range of texts that we're bringing in. Basically, we've got a really fun book club to sit and talk to each month and say, okay, what did you think about this text? We ask a whole bunch of questions, we get their responses, and as you can imagine, they're very varied. We've got a range of reactions to these books. For me too, narrowing down these books was, oh my gosh, an impossible task, because I'm not only a researcher in way, but obviously a pretty passionate fan of it. So quite hard to cull that. In particular, though, coming to it, I know I had a few components I wanted to include, which was diversity, intersectionality as well. So we didn't just want it to be, here is, one gay character, that is it, that's all the components to their identity. As well as we definitely wanted to prioritise having Australian texts. So half of our texts, of which we've got 6, are Australian, and own voices as well. That was a particularly interesting component for me that I wanted to introduce. So own voices, if your listeners aren't aware, is essentially a movement where the author of the novel is identifies or has the same identity as generally the protagonist of the novel. So to really speak to authenticity there a bit more than say, and offer more of a platform to diverse voices as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about intersectionality as well, and the definition of diversity as it fits with your work?
Yeah, great question, because I've been a bit vague with that. So yeah, intersectionality in particular, one of the books I think we found, which I find is just stunning, it's perfect, great read in general, is Kindred, which is a collection, it's an Australian Love Oz YA novel. Anthology, sorry, I should say, collection of short stories by a range of authors. And so intersectionality in this case in particular, we're talking about those intersecting identities. So not keeping everything in their separated components. We've got characters, for instance, who might be queer in some way. They might be gay, they might be also intersex, or they might be also transgender, for instance, or non-binary, or they might also be disabled. They might be people of color. So we're not just looking at stereotypically in queer YA. The history is really cemented in, let's say, more I'm trying to think of the right term for this, but I suppose in the industry it's almost seen as what's the most accessible, or what's the most but for the identities that are most, I suppose, mainstream, let's say, which is a bit of an odd way of putting it. So we generally would traditionally see in queer YA, when we could see any versions of queer characters, they would be white, they would be male, they would be cisgender, and they would be gay. So that would be as far as we could get. And they're important stories to see, but we did want to see other narratives out there, and not only essentially emphasize the importance too of queer identity, but emphasize that it's one component of a character and a person's identity.
Fantastic. And I think, having read, as I said, Peter Lyle's Rating Normal, it's not just about a gay character, it's about a character who has an alphabet of disabilities that forms a part of who she is, and it's not white, cis, male, etc. So yeah, fantastic. And it was such a beautiful eye-opener for me to read that, because I have a little nephew who has a little bit of one of the things that the main character has, and it was okay, now I get how his brain works, and how it possibly works, and it made a whole lot more sense to me then.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a stunning novel, and it's a great example of it too, yes. I think, in that case. So we have such an exploration of identity there as well.
Yeah. Tell me then, definition of YA, because, in my very brief research, apparently 12 to 20-year-olds, but may include books written for adults which have appealed to young readers. And, as always, teenagers became a powerful force of the economy in the 1930s, apparently. That's where they kind of got the connection, and then got the prominence in the 60s. Is that kind of where it sits with you?
Yeah, actually, that's a really good insight to it. So the idea, of a teenager is only a fairly new concept at all in the first place. And so we have, the first YA or young adult text is S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders, the year of which the publication escapes me right now, but I'm sure we can figure that one.
Well, that's okay.
And it really is, it does come from, I suppose, that commercial bracket. The first author was a young adult when they authored it as well, S.E. Hinton. So it's a fascinating genre. It is actually, I shouldn't say genre, I will correct myself there. I've fallen into the pitfall that every other academic will run at me, and writer, I should say. So young adult literature is more of a general field, I suppose, than a genre, because there are so many genres within that space. You could have paranormal romance, things like Twilight that are obviously been quite popularized in the 2000s. You could have horror, you could have thriller, you can have contemporary realism, of which I think a few of the texts that I'm talking about in this project are based. You could have speculative fiction, so they come under all gamuts. Generally, it's presented in that space of saying, roughly from about 12 to 20, although I'm getting close to 30 now and I'm refusing to put them away. It's still the majority of things I read. So it's not just that the protagonist is a young adult themselves, although that's often a component. We do have adult fiction where we've got a teenage protagonist or a child protagonist, and it doesn't necessarily classify them then in the category of YA or children's literature. Often they also fulfill the narrative component of the Bildungsroman, which is the coming of age narrative, which I find in itself has some really fascinating overlap with the notion of, in queer literature, the coming out narrative.
So what was that again? Could you tell me that one?
Oh, Bildungsroman. So it means coming of age.
Right.
Do you mind if I jump in at this point? Because that's I think a really good segue into one of my questions. When it comes, you mentioned that the most recent research you were performing was kind of based around that demographic parameter of 18 to 30, but with YA, which is not a demographic I'm familiar with as far as that literature. I'm just wondering, from your research and from your understanding of the, not as you pointed out, not the genre, but the field, what determines a young adult? Has that shifted at all since multimedia and technology has become such an important part? So for me, I'm thinking of 12 to 20. That's a demographic of young adults who have never known a world without an internet. And therefore, how much of their learning has been accelerated, or for good or bad, whether it's been correct information or not, but their sense of identity, the sense of the world, that knowledge that surely must have accelerated to some degree, because obviously prior to the internet, books were a way of discovering things. Now you can discover things on your phone. Has that shifted the the pure audience of young adult, for example, where did it used to be 12 to 14 that maybe had a more dominant reading effect, and now it is towards the what we term adult, the 18s? Or has the fact that multimedia and technology plays such a big part, has that shifted the actual style and I guess mature nature of the YA books?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few answers to that. It is an interesting shift, although I think what we've actually seen in recent years is there's been more of a draw to YA and to publishing, to purchasing physical books over time. Obviously, that, you know, people can get it up on their phones and they can seek information elsewhere. Whereas, as you've mentioned there, conventionally, you've got things like Forever by Judy Blume, where people could find out about sex and puberty all through this, you know, handy book there, you know, if you couldn't Google it. I do think it's changed the way that some of the themes we might see emerging. We can have some more mature themes, some more complex themes. Something I always push back against is this idea of the young adult as being maybe not prepared for certain, let's say, adult, and I'm sort of using finger quotes there for that one, adult themes or adult topics. Whereas, of course, they've been engaging with this, you know, very young age. It's just in the world. I do think sometimes that introduction to that access to media has shifted. So one thing in particular we have seen change over time is the introduction of the new adult genre, which has sort of shifted a bit itself. It has changed, it's emerged its own field. It's not necessarily as strong as it was a few years ago. That's something that came out particularly in a few years post 9/11. So as a whole range, a generation of teenagers were coming of age in a very different looking world. And of course, that's looking at personally, looking at politically, socially, but also looking at that introduction of technology to a degree that we weren't used to. So that new adult's other field, which is in particular looking at, say, what happens beyond the coming of age, or arguing that we are always continuing to come of age to a degree. So it'll deal with generally much more explicit themes. Young adult literature will often have to engage with, and has a history of engaging with, didacticism, I should say, censorship, the idea of what can we show teenagers, what's dangerous for them to see, versus, you know, what do they need to see, what do they want to see, and that always comes into that dialogue of, well, who is writing for the young adult, and does that change things? Similar with children's literature, if we have adults writing for children or teenagers, controlling the narratives of what comes out. So new adult was, I think, a genre that really emerged in this particular space that we're talking about as almost a bit of an answer to it, and yet I think it hasn't necessarily come out as strongly or as successfully as it would have liked, because people didn't really know how to categorize these novels. And so it sort of has bled back in. But I think some of those same themes have been reabsorbed into young adult literature to a fascinating extent, where people are constantly debating now, where is that line? Where is the boundary? Is young adult only intended for teenagers, or can it go beyond? And I'm certainly saying I really hope so. And in this project in particular, you know, we've got people who are even I think up to like 32 saying these books are still so important to me and have been such a foundational part of my experience finding my identity, or finding what's not my identity. And so I do think they can be overlooked as almost this notion of, well, we put them aside when we get to this certain age. But I'd argue absolutely that young adult can appeal to any age, and should, really, despite the fact that it is focused on such a foundational and liminal period in someone's life.
I think that's a really interesting point too, because interesting you brought up the very well-known Judy Blume's Forever, for example. So, you know, if you went back to 1980 and spoke to let's say, for example, a 13-year-old and presented that book, it was, you know, that was a way of exploring adult themes and taboo, and, you know, it was pushing those boundaries, slowly incorporating adult world. But if you were to hand, my guess, and of course this is no way my expertise, but my guess is if I took a copy of Forever to a 13-year-old now, assuming that 13-year-old has had, you know, access to internet, I can't imagine that book would resonate as much. So I could only guess that YA now would have to incorporate much more mature themes, and then that would probably flow on to the fact that at 30, 35, you can still pick up a YA and it still resonates there too, because you've had to draw that adult bow closer to the teenage marker. Do you think that is how it's rolling forward?
I think to a degree, yes. So I think in particular, the reason why young adult literature can appeal to so many people of so many ages is because there's a universality in the emotion behind it, in that even if, you know, you're far past your teenage years and you can't remember, or you don't want to remember them, you will still resonate, I think, that emotionality that's embedded within them. And whether it's a first experiences or, and I think even if it's not explicit themes. So we do have a mix, and there's a real push at the moment as well between, what, again, that question of what can we present in these texts? Will it encourage teens to go off the rails? And of course, as you mentioned with Judy Blume's book, what's seen as quite taboo and what was, a banned book back in the day isn't treated anywhere near as such today. Although I will say it is still fairly frank, that book. Reading it even now, I'm still going, wow, okay, she was able to get away with quite a lot. Whereas you might still have a bit of a censorship pushback today with certain books. But it really depends on the author. It often depends too on the genre. So genre texts, I will say, so such as fantasy, paranormal literature, often seem to have a lot more flexibility in presenting darker or more explicit themes sometimes than something, say, that's maybe in contemporary realism, because they can use metaphor, they can use magical sort of realism, things like that, in order to cloak the issues they're discussing and engage with them differently. So it's not necessarily that we're becoming darker necessarily, or more adult with our themes. I think we've just got much more diversity in terms of what we can explore, what we are allowing sort of or understanding that teens are ready for and can engage with, and giving them much more credit, I think, at times, which is fantastic.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, that's an excellent way to look at it.
So can I ask you, Annika, why do you think it's important for the reader to see themselves in books?
Oh my gosh, yeah, great question. Yeah. So this goes back to an academic, and I'm going to have to look up their name actually and get back to you on the actual one, but I'll come back to that, who wrote a really fantastic piece, Windows, Mirrors and Sliding Doors. Oh, that's it, Rudine Bishop Sims, or I might be messing up that name in some order. That's a question for Google. I will get to that. But this idea too of, particularly say for white teens, for instance, that you could pick up any book off the shelf. You might see yourself quite literally reflected on the cover, but you can definitely find yourself within the pages if you're able-bodied, if you're white, if you're cishet. So, we need to also be able to have those same teens experience the idea of, say, looking at yourself in the mirror, but also looking through the window and seeing other people's experiences. So this is something that's important for everyone, just as much so, if not more so, I would say. It's so important for anyone to be able to access their identity within books. So be able to see yourself and be able to see a range of experiences. So moving beyond just, say, having one key text that's meant to typify your entire existence. So being able to access multiple aspects of your identity as well. And that can be at times where intersectionality comes from. So there are certain books where, or certain, actually what I should say is there's certain parts of my identity that I've always been able to very easily find in literature, but there's other parts that I definitely cannot. So it's wanting to try seek those out and wanting to be able to freely access them without there also being, for instance, if we're looking at queer literature, a sense of the taboos. We want to be able to learn more about ourselves. And I think it's incredibly important for all teenagers, or all readers really, I should say, no matter the age, to be able to see themselves. Amberlynn Quay-Mulliner does some fantastic writing on this topic in particular, and the importance of, say, for instance, young Indigenous children being able to see themselves in picture books, in novels, in the world, and basically be able to see themselves storying the world. So beautiful stuff. I don't think I could say it more articulately than she does.
So, because we certainly had Gary Lonsbury express that very thing when he was talking about his book, The Boy from the Mist, is that he wished he'd been able to see himself in books growing up.
Absolutely. I think that's why that's such a powerful novel.
Yes.
That's one I'm looking forward to coming up to analysing it in our groups in a few months. So I think it's just going to be fantastic. When I first saw that coming out, I hadn't read it yet. Everything else on the list I'd selected and narrowed down, I read, and I saw that, read the synopsis, went, okay, immediately, we have to have this. It's going to be brilliant. I don't care. I'm so excited. So you can really see the power. Oh, it's brilliant. Yeah, I think I could just reread that a million times over, and brilliant.
I can't wait for it to be on Netflix. But anyway, that'll be another thing.
Sorry, to interrupt there, Veronica, but that's where I think it could get tricky. And now I'm starting to really appreciate and I know you've sort of educated me a lot on this, Veronica, because there's not so many concepts I wasn't really familiar with, but that idea of own voice, because I was sitting here thinking, well, I think there's reflections of all manner of society and slowly coming through, for example, movies and television. But that's at the mercy of writers often not going to be own voice. And therefore, it may be a false sort of identities being put on the screen trying to please, certain demographics or productions or whatever it might be. Whereas now I'm starting to really appreciate how important it is, the book as a medium, that's written by, for example, like someone like Gary, who writes his own, potentially his own voice, because then there's a lot more truth there. So yeah, I'm starting to appreciate that, because I could just imagine as things roll out with movies and stuff, they stuff it up for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so powerful too in books, because I mean, the history really of literature there is we would get someone who was well-meaning, obviously, and thought, okay, I need to include, say, more diversity, and it's almost that sense of token diversity, or there to educate. So again, coming from a well-meaning space, but then in execution, maybe incidentally reinforcing stereotypes, and also the fact that we can say, okay, it's great that that existed and that was maybe opening the door, but now we have a platform for more people, different voices, own voices to come in. So, you know, in the past we might have, say, a white author who goes, okay, I'd really love to make sure I'm, you know, presenting diversity, so I'm going to make this character biracial, I'm going to make them Indigenous, for instance. And I'm not going to point fingers at anyone in particular, but there are some authors who really, again, well-meaning, you can see from their author's notes, but they've said that was maybe in, say, the early 2000s. They would not do the same now. They'd recognize that maybe they're not the person who should be writing that. Maybe they should be mentoring someone or offering a space somehow from their platform in order to have these own voices come out. So I do think there's been such a shift in terms of diversity in YA and own voices in YA. Which, you know, can become complicated at times in terms of if people feel that they're gatekeeping into certain spaces. I won't get into that, but it has been a bit of a contentious point lately. But yeah, I think just amazing to have those opportunities and to offer those platforms now.
It's good.
Most definitely.
Yeah. Because I spoke with Kate Cuthbert from Writers Victoria, and she put us onto an interview that Radia Chowdhury did in Liminal. And Radia is a Muslim Bangladeshi Australian author, and she's the commissioning editor for Penguin, and currently working as at Penguin Random House, but also a commissioning author for First Nations people of colour. And it's just amazing interview that she spoke about. And it reminds me, as you said, you know, well-meaning white Australian middle class people are in charge of all the publishing, you know, in charge of all the commissioning, and, you know, think they're doing a good job. And it's yeah, it doesn't come out right. The own voices is so important, and giving the power to the people to tell their own stories, to be represented in every aspect of art and the economy and the world. Yeah, amazing.
Absolutely.
Okay, there wasn't a question there, so that was just a thought that was
no, I'm just completely agreeing.
Well, I'll throw a question in.
I have got one. No, my turn. Hang on there. But okay. No, you go. If you're going on from that, I'm just sitting with that for a moment. Go ahead, Darren.
Yeah, just in relation to that comment just made, I'm wondering how, I haven't had a chance to listen to that interview yet, but I'm wondering how tricky it is in the sense of ultimately it becomes, you know, publishing is, you know, its ultimate master is the purchaser, isn't it? The person that purchased the books. So as our society becomes more diverse, then you would think then the opportunity for more diverse authors, you know, through YA and through other demographics should be able to grow. So I'm just wondering, you know, it's a balancing act, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think we've seen that there's a huge push for this. There's been a push back in previous years from the publishing industry in Australia, in America in particular, saying, you know, these books won't sell though, we're trying, but they're just not selling. And that can also say, well, you know, marketing can be a huge thing. There used to be and it's been heavily disproven at this point, but there used to be the idea that, oh, we can't put anyone who's black on the cover because it just won't sell. And that's, I think, speaking to an American market, and that was the adage throughout, and people have found that is blatantly untrue. We've been able to push back against, and the importance too of seeing a character of color, for instance. I think what's one that comes to mind, Amberlyn Quaymulla's The Interrogation of a Shayla Wolf, has the first Indigenous Australian, well, I suppose it's a model on the front cover for a dystopian novel ever in Australia, I think, or potentially could be worldwide, but I want to double check that. But that's monumental to have that imagery and to have something that's so apparent too. So paratext, you know, is just as important, I think, at times, in terms of, you know, we say don't judge a book by its cover, but oh my gosh, we absolutely should at times. It's fantastic to see that. That's another important form of representation.
And even Anita Heiss's latest book, and I will absolutely butcher the title, but to see Billa Yaradungalangaray, and I heard Anita speak on the Sydney Writers' Fest, and she said even she was learning her language and, you know, I think it was her sisters or some of her aunties were saying, yeah, I don't think you got it quite right. But to see Indigenous language on the cover of, a book that you can just pick up, which I did a couple of weeks back, picked up her book in the shop, and there it was, just, beautifully written in language, which is fantastic.
Oh, it's amazing. And I think that's got to be one of the first.
Yes. I'm pretty sure she said it was the first.
Surely.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah. Nice.
Huge step forward, I think. That sounds like.
Yeah, slowly but surely. All right. So tell me, and hopefully this is a nice, easy one for you, why the Australian perspective?
Yes, absolutely. So this is something, for me personally, it was just so important to bring in and to say we want to have that representation. It's something that me as a voracious reader as a teenager was always trying to track down more of. Obviously, the publishing industry has shifted a lot itself. But I think conventionally the things I was reading, majority would have been American, majority would have been maybe British, for instance, as well. So I wasn't getting anywhere near enough of our own country's stories as I would like. And so when we came to this project, I went, okay, I know there's some fantastic, and this is again was so hard to narrow it down. I know there's some amazing queer YA, and I love that I could even say it's not just that there's one Australian queer YA. We actually have a plethora to look through. So I was looking at things by Will Kostakis. I was looking at things by Erin Go, or Goff, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce that one, as well. So there's some amazing ones out there, and it was wonderful to be able to draw from that and then go, oh, my problem is I have too many, which is, not a problem I think I would have had when I was younger. But I think we tend to sometimes maybe have to limit ourselves and say, okay, the texts I can engage with and the identities I can engage with are, say, from a very American perspective, which is, obviously saturates our media in Australia. But being able to actually fight through that and say there is Australian text out there, there is particularly as queer Australian text out there, just feels like a wonderful space to be in. And I think to see that, again, authenticity of experience, because this project is so based on, well, can you see yourself and what's your relationship like to these books? To be able to find a variety of experiences there was fantastic. One of the questions I think that came up pretty early on was, are you aware of queer Australian YA or even Australian young adult literature? And I was actually quite surprised by some of the participants, quite a large amount of them actually, who said, no, I really didn't know, and I've been looking for this, but I didn't know where to look. I didn't know this was out there. So that for me has been the biggest shock. And I said, don't worry, I'm putting together a reading list.
Excellent.
Which everyone's delighted about. Like, thankfully, I'm not giving them extra homework, but we're all contributing to it to put together a really nice pool of resources and to say, oh, okay, just to have these conversations in the community and find out, what is accessible. But I did just want to add, thinking, why Australian YA? I think obviously, given the focus of this project, it's important to have that. But also because, of course, I wanted to have that space. Australian voices, Australian stories are so beautiful. We have such a particular tone and a humour and a style that can, I think, just be, we can really see it in Australian texts. And so they've got such a particular tone and flavour to them that, you can see my pro style coming in here and going, oh, they're just beautiful. It's the flavour, it's the richness of the text. So,
And so familiar. And it's even being able to see streets that you knew, towns that you know, names that you understand in the text. Hence one of the reasons that we have Australian book lovers, and we wanted, ours is a really big reading list, to put all the Australian books that we could find and to offer Australian authors a place to have them all there, because it is so important to, encourage people to read more Australian text. Yeah, fantastic. I did also want to say that I know a lot of people well over 30 read a lot of YA, and particularly from the Twitter writing community, a lot of the people that I know there happily admit that they love YA, particularly, follow the Love Oz YA, and they do a lot of reading of, I'm going to say speculative fiction in my case, that I know a lot of the people that I hang about with on Twitter are speculative fiction readers and writers. So there's some fantastic works, Jay Christoph and Amy Kaufman have got some fantastic works there. So have you thought about, you mentioned sort of the magic, and that is the ability to couch some of these concepts in interesting challenges and, in sort of analogies and those kind of things. So what are you finding from your participants? I know it's only early days. Have you had one of your workshops, your book clubs yet?
Yeah, so we actually just
Yep.
had our first 3 sessions just this past week. So
Ah,
I've sort of got it
very
very
good.
fresh in my mind, where we talked about, we actually talked about an American text, but I thought
Yep.
it was a fairly foundational one, Two Boys Kissing by David Levithian.
Mm-hmm. And what did they, well, I guess, if you can share any of the, completely unidentified, what were their thoughts behind seeing themselves, examining their experience of queer representation in YA literature?
Yeah, I think what was lovely is almost immediately it felt like there was this sense of community in
Yep.
sharing these stories, and in sharing sometimes due to the lack of being able to find stories. So because we had a range of ages, we had some people who were closer to 30 and saying, I just couldn't see these sort of books when I was younger. And we did talk about what would it mean to you to read this when you were younger. And we had people who were fresh out of, high school, they're in their first year of university, who were saying, I've always had access to these books. And it's been an integral part of finding out my identity and seeing it affirmed in literature. So to know that you exist, to know that there's nothing wrong with you, I think, we'd like to think we've moved on from the sort of problem novels of the 80s, which basically, if we have a queer character, someone will inevitably die. It's a bit of a tragedy. It gets a bit, exhausting. And so even in selecting these texts, we really wanted to focus on ones that were quite celebratory rather than only engaging in trauma. So I think, some of the early findings we've found so far is just people really wanting to share that experience of how visceral too and how emotional it can be, regardless of their thoughts, even of the narrative, just to know that there are characters out there and just to know people are writing these stories for them, and that sometimes that they are pinpointed straight to them. So I think at times we are seeing elements of, acknowledging trauma or homophobia or even difficulties with familial relationships and the experience of coming out, but also using the books as an avenue to explore that and broach these topics, and really understand and connect with people in a really empathetic way.
That's good. And lots to come, obviously. How long will your project go on for?
Yeah, so it's over 6 months over the focus group. So 1 book per month. We're also hoping to potentially go off into some, maybe let's say smaller projects after this, but and expand into potentially a seminar style, or symposium style, I should say, group at the end, and maybe bring in, if we can, hopefully we've got the budget we've put aside to bring in some local Australian authors to sort of speak to these people who have been saying these books mean so much to me, they've had an impact, and that's where in particular I want to really lean onto the Australian element of it all and find our own voices. We also had the idea of potentially, if we can, asking any of the participants if they'd like to contribute something potentially from a creative writing piece that we can look to maybe put to a small press, see what we can do with that to continue to give them space to share their own experiences and their own voices from the project.
Fantastic. It reminds me of the books, growing up disabled in Australia, growing up Aboriginal in Australia. There's some great stories there, a whole range of styles and I guess vehicles for people expressing parts of their story. Yeah, that would be beautiful.
Absolutely.
Darren, I've been hogging the conversation now.
No, I've been listening intently. It's fascinating. And as you were both discussing own voices and obviously, coming to understand a little bit more about your identity through reading books where you can see yourself. It is a interesting one because, for example, myself, when I only speak for myself when growing up, and there would come, an international day, for example, and growing up in quite a multicultural suburb, someone with Greek origins would bring Greek food, or, there'd be the Greek dress and the Dutch. And the irony is as an Aussie, there was a little bit of a black hole there when it came to identity, in the sense of, I don't think any one of us could agree on an Australian meal right now that would represent Australia or a code of dress. I know we say we're a multicultural country, which we absolutely are, but I'm just wondering, now that the own voice is coming through and we really are finally bringing all these very important, all the wonderful colours of society and what makes us all human beings together, are we also moving forward and creating a new sense of identity, as far as coming from a purely Australian perspective, with regards to what it means to be Australian, no longer being so influenced by American culture, which was, inevitable back prior to, when we were dictated by TV channels as opposed to on demand or what it might be. Or, as you mentioned before, there was a big shift in Australian literature when it came to YA. Is there a new identity growing forward? Is there a combination of all of our different cultural backgrounds? Is there a new vision of what an Australian is coming through, do you think?
Oh, I love that. Yeah. I think quite possibly. And I do think if we're going to find it, it's going to first emerge in young adult literature, which is often ahead of the curve. So we might see certain patterns and trends emerging then in, say, TV or film years after the fact. So I find it often really does start to come out in YA first. I think we just need to continue giving the platform to a wide variety of voices is going to be the way, though, to have that shared. And that's too where places where like non-traditional publications can be even more effective in developing those ideas of identity or developing a wider sense of identity. For instance, I think we were talking about technology before, but with say different apps, you could just, people have TikTok, Book Talk in particular is a nice little frame in there where people will go off and be chatting to each other, sharing book recommendations, and you can have almost Australian subdivisions of that. So, or fan fiction, even things like that, where people are creating, they're contributing their experiences, their ideas, and their unique voice. So I do think there are multiple opportunities to see this continue to emerge. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it'll be in very good hands if I would much rather have the young adult and obviously those coming up after that bring together something of a new identity for Australians, something with a lot more understanding, a lot more empathy, and a lot more inclusive. Absolutely, because it's definitely not something for the generations that have already played through this medium. It's not up to them in any way. So I think it's in very good hands. But I wouldn't mind switching gear for just a little bit because I'm quite interested in reading just a brief abstract in relation to one of your works, Dr. Herb, and that was, this is a mouthful obviously, so I'm going to try and say it without mucking up, nonlinear modes of narrative in the disruption of time and genre in Amberlin Quamelina's The Interrogation of Ashla Wolf. Now, if I've read it or interpreted it correctly, I understand you discuss in that publication basically the disruption of post-apocalyptic and or dystopian fiction by way of incorporating Indigenous knowledge into a set of problems that is projected forward in time so that we can see where those problems will reach or what the outcome of these problems. I'm just wondering, can you explain a little bit exactly how this works and what's the inspiration behind diving into that sort of avenue of research? Because I think the idea of incorporating Indigenous knowledge, which is pretty much ancient and possibly one of the most ancient forms of wisdom and knowledge on the planet as far as the human beings are concerned, how that can fit so importantly and powerfully in dystopian or post-apocalyptic fiction, and is it possibly a way to offer some saving grace and hope?
Absolutely. I love that question. I haven't thought about it. I love this particular article. It's a lot of fun and fascinating to write in particular. So yeah, I think Amberlin Quamelina says some fantastic things about this in particular. So I'm sort of leaning on her words quite heavily here, but she talks about the fact that Indigenous Australians have been living in a dystopian time, have lived through the apocalypse. So post-apocalyptic fiction can be a really, let's say, spot-on sort of genre to engage in then, and sort of shift away from the conventions that we normally see, which is what this article and this research in particular is about. So, and also the idea of speculative fiction as a place of hope. So this notion too that we do obviously acknowledge that there's such ancient knowledge, ancient history there to explore, and indigenous epistemologies, I should say. So that can also still be a really forward-thinking space as well. And I'm already getting in my own way here, I think, by speaking in such linear terms. But this idea that we can integrate that into what we normally see as very, post-futuristic spaces. And of course, it's always been there. It's always had that capability. It's sometimes about rewriting how we consider that. So in particular in this space, what I was noticing in that novel and in that series of novels, The Tribe, which is fantastic, would very highly recommend, is that we're seeing a lot of, say, the dystopian tropes, for instance, where we've got nature overcoming the earth. We've returned to that. It's sometimes seen as a wild or transgressive space. It's something to be feared, but ultimately the hero might find sanctuary in it. But that's always a journey. In, for instance, this particular series, we have the heroine like really embedded in that space. And in the First Wooded, it's called. So she's seeing it too as a living, breathing entity and understanding it as such. So really shifting away from Western understandings of space, which would still maybe present it, I think, in quite a limited aspect. If you look at, say, and this is no shade on Scott Westerfeld's novels, but if you look to, say, something like Uglies, we have a very conventional depiction of how nature can be engaged with and respected, whereas we have it on a completely different spectrum when we look at something like The Tribe. And same with time as well. So that's in particular the focus of that, where we have everything in that novel is essentially compressed into 3 days, and yet it is presented in a really stark non-linear manner. So it might take the reader, if they're not used to it, a bit of space, a bit of time to get into it. And then once you do, we sort of surrender to the flow of that writing structure. And it's just absolutely amazing. And it brings out the narrative in such a different way. So I quite like how, in particular, she plays with these expectations of dystopia by simply imbuing it with Indigenous knowledges and ideas of story and storying the world is just absolutely fantastic. That was a bit non-linear in its own way. I think I've gone quite roundabout. So let me know if that's made any sense. I will also say in that space too, I am a white Australian reading into this. So for me, it's always trying to be very aware of my positionality and coming in and what I can and can't maybe comment on, what epistemologies I can apply. But I'm also coming from a space of acknowledging Indigenous epistemology, Indigenous knowledge as just as valid as Western knowledge. And that's a frustrating thing to even have to say, but it is something that often in research, you're having to position and say, okay, I'm not just applying this lens, I'm acknowledging that this is just as valid, if not more so, than the Western ones that we don't have to justify and we don't generally need to validate in any way.
I myself love dystopian literature and a writer of it, but when I read a lot of those words, obviously in the abstract, I haven't read the whole piece, but it really injected into me this excitement at the idea of finally, yes, hopefully there is the scenario where ancient knowledge, especially in Australia, is being incorporated and can become something, like you said, that is on equal footing, but also respected with a whole new level. And that I think from a writer's perspective opens up a whole range of opportunities when it comes to literary tools to really, ignite imagination, but also to, rewrite plots in new and profound ways. And, I love the idea of non-linear literature, as far as I'm assuming that means in the prose, but also non-linear in the sense of a lot of their timeless narratives in their stories and dream times and knowledge that can be used in our approach to how do we move forward or invigorate the young adults, so to speak, to round it back to the conversation, because they're going to be tasked with searching for ways to save us as a race and save the planet, and to find new ways of building that relationship with Mother Nature. And it could be that through all of these different moving pieces coming together, sense of identity, their own voices, are able to explore their identity and therefore become a lot more confident in feeling part of society, and therefore feeling partly responsible for society, working together. And then with something like what we just talked about with Indigenous knowledge being injected into a set of problems, wow, there just might be a whole lot of hope moving forward, as opposed to a lack of hope that it's often easy to think there might be.
Yeah, and I love that so much, because I think this novel, more than I would say pretty much any dystopian novel, like I love dystopia, but this novel for me really had an authentic sense of hope, and it offered up a solution too. If you, I'll try not to spoil it, but at the culmination of the series, so it's a trilogy, we have this real emphasis on connection to just between human, between nature, between all forms of life through an Indigenous perspective as well. So acknowledging the life of, say, a rock as well is just as valid, just as important. And it's just stunningly done. And I don't think I could even do it justice in the way I'm describing it. But I think for me, that really embodied that notion of hope that we see so many dystopian novels striving to reach at the end. And so there is still, opportunities. But I think novels like this, you can actually see it. You can see almost a path to get there as well.
So almost a seed for a paradigm shift is going to be found in novels
beautifully
like
said,
yeah.
I was going to say, I like that phrase. I might turn up in a paper one day. I'll try to give you credit.
It's all right, copyright don't because no 2021. No. No, not at all. One thing, because it's young adult, mentioned before, it's not a genre, should I say, sorry, a demographic field of literature that I'm familiar with, in the sense of it's not something I hunt out, but I don't hunt anything in specific in general. Anyway, long-winded way of saying, what I am fascinated with, though, sitting back as an observer with, virtually no skin in the game, is how young adults are finding the tools to develop that sense of identity. Obviously, we've seen a big educational uprising in the different sort of gender expressions and the way people choose to just feel comfortable about themselves and how they'd like to project themselves into the world. Absolutely, I've seen so much of for me, I think there's a big link between technology, because from my perspective, it feels as though online you can be anything. If you can try different genre, bend your genre a little bit, try a different gender and total, or explore, because your identity, you create your identity to a certain degree online. So I think that says something very powerful about the future, and science fiction wise, as far as when we begin to upload consciousness. I still think this is our baby steps, because our gender and our body appreciation is not going to be necessary once we get to a point where we're 80% mind and digital rather than physical. But nonetheless, what was interested after all of that is looking at the top bestsellers for young adults of 2021 so far, just looking at some of the Penguin listings, and I was amazed to see that technology was very minimal as far as the subjects. It really is murder and dragons and fantasy and all those fantastic
Nothing wrong with dragons
things.
and fantasy, Darren. We've had this discussion.
No, that's fantastic. But I was just surprised that that it wasn't there wasn't a whole range of cyberbullying or virtual worlds, and it's just a shock for me. So I'm just wondering, is it because that is just normal for them? When I say them, the younger generation of today. I'd hate to pigeonhole anybody. Do you know what I mean? As far as you look at, I was just looking at all the book covers, and I expected at least see maybe 15%, 20% of some sort of exploration of online interactions, online relationships, or building, that second life, that second personality in virtual spaces, especially now with the Oculus and stuff. But I didn't see it there. So yeah, it's a fascinating observation. I think that some of the archetypal stories still coming through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're always going to see those. The interesting thing about what you're commenting on there is, if you, and this is going to sound a bit strange, but if you look back, say 20 years or even further, you'll actually see those stories. You'll see that focus of, concern of what's this going to do? What's the notion of the post-human in particular? And even with technology and moving away from sort of what things are coming up in books, you can see, as you mentioned too, with people being able to experiment with gender expression or gender fluidity, gender identity in particular, or even sexuality in different forms of online or different forms of media. I know I recently saw something which I think could be a fascinating study, but people talking quite casually about, my first experience of experimenting with my gender, for instance, I did through something like The Sims, where you can build a version of yourself and live it out. And so people would experiment with changing their identity and then find out later, actually turns out I'm transgender, and The Sims 1 or something was the first way I discovered that.
Yeah, fascinating new tools, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you look at, in particular, with how we incorporate technology into novels. So for quite a while, we actually had people really, unless we had something, full-on sci-fi dystopian, what does this mean? Are there boundless possibilities for this? Or it would maybe take quite a fearful approach at times, which is shifting to be a lot more hopeful, I will say, as we see that, technology is so integrated into the day-to-day. But there's this notion too of, well, what can we put in that's not going to date this story terribly? I mentioned TikTok before. Potentially, by the time people are listening to this, or if they're listening to it a bit later, they might go, what even is TikTok? That's so old. No one uses that.
Is it like MySpace? That's
exactly.
That's my excuse why I haven't played with it then.
Yeah, perfect. You're staying ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I'm ahead.
Yeah. But, if they mention texting, or if they, using their phones, or they're mentioning music, anything that's very much, of the now, you've got to be really careful with. You can see why some authors stray away if they want to sort of, have someone be able to come to this book in a few years, for instance, and not go, this feels a bit odd, what are they doing? But it's interesting too, though, to see that sort of immediacy too of technology that's still embedded quite naturally, I think, in a very different way these days than we used to see it.
Yeah, that's a really good point of making sure that the stories stay timeless, so that they carry a little bit more distance when it comes to inspiring people. But one other quick question. Let's say, Dr. Herb, you wake up tomorrow and you are tasked with, to save the planet, you must write the greatest young adult book society as I've seen yet.
No pressure.
No pressure. What would be, you mentioned you do love dystopian fiction, but what would be, if you had to sit down and start hammering on that keyboard, what would be your genre, do you think?
Probably more, I would say, either paranormal or maybe, let's say, urban fantasy. Or actually, you know what, I'll be honest, it's going to be a mix of that sort of fairy tale mashup as well. So I'm also cheating a bit here by going, this is sort of what I did for my thesis. So my background's also in creative writing, and I think something I just buried myself in was a sort of mashup of paranormal, let's say suburban fantasy, with the fairy tale genre. So like fractured feminist fairy tales, things like that. And that's sort of still my go-to, that anytime I'm sort of itching at the keyboard, I go, this is where we can find these really powerful stories, but always, of course, within YA.
And urban fantasy, I'm not sure if I'm familiar with that, let alone a paranormal urban fantasy. Could you maybe give me a little bit of an insight? That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So urban fantasy is almost this lovely sense of like grittiness, where we have fantasy, but it's set within, say, cities. So let me think, like Cassandra Clare in particular has a lot of those. We have that integration of magic stepping into the real world, might be integrated with technology in some form. So we have a real difference between, you know, when we step outside to another world, you know, we go through the wardrobe in Narnia, or we go off to Hogwarts, et cetera, et cetera. Here we have magic really seeping into the cracks and the corners of, you know, again, it's a real sense of grittiness to it, I think, which is embedded in that notion of reality. So fantasy can be very much set in escapism to a degree. Whereas, which also goes back to what I was briefly thinking before in terms of why we're not seeing technology on these lists, why we've got, you know, a focus on, say, dragons, fantasy. It might be to a degree a sense of escapism of, you know, we have all this in my day-to-day life. I'd rather go look at the magic.
Yes.
You know, very much fair enough. I can understand. So yeah, we have that something that I quite like is the idea of suburban fantasy, which is, you know, obviously bringing it to a very Australian sense. So I'd love to see more of that.
Definitely.
I think, in the world.
Please write some. And there you.
I think the world. It sounds like the world's safe.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
So you've got a short story published. What else is out there with the name of Annika Herb on it?
Yeah, so a few different articles. I'm working on a few things, and from this project, I hope to be able to get a few more out based on queer literature in particular. So I've recently published something in, if anyone's interested, it's more, you know, very academic style, but it's on the representation of possession as a form of rape culture in paranormal romance in YA literature. Sounds like a bit of a heavy topic, but I promise it's an interesting one.
Yep.
And as well, recently just working, so as you mentioned, I've got a short story published in Heroines, which is a lovely little anthology. They've got a few others out, I believe, at the moment as well. Working, though, in the background on a few different manuscripts that I am determined to get out into the world at some point. But yes,
Excellent.
all Australian-based, which is quite a lot of fun to try and always Australianise it that bit more.
We'll have to get those links, and we'll put those in the show notes when we get the podcast up. What I'd like for you to share with the listeners, having had a number of friends go through PhDs and then eventually they survive, and then what comes out as well as their PhD, which is the whole big thesis that is academic, then they often will, I'll just say, transition that into a more popular text that's able to be understood by, you know, a less academic audience. So is there something that will be at the end of this project that we've been talking about, which is the reader experience of queer representation in YA? And I'm interested in your thoughts about the influence of research such as this on the general reading audience or on the populace, on the population. How does research influence future reading?
Absolutely. So I think it can actually steer it. We're really hoping with this we could potentially expand into, say, an educational space and say, these are the sort of books that teens are wanting to read. These are fine, you know, it's healthy for them to read, it's productive for them to read, and it will, you know, for anyone, regardless of how they identify, to be able to access these texts. So we'd like to push into that sort of space. We'd also really like to be able to make it accessible. And so we're looking at a few avenues for that in terms of writing up this research in a publicly accessible way. I mean, that's stuff I love to read. You don't want to necessarily come to something and go, this is an interesting topic, but it's just so heavy on the jargon.
Yes.
So we'd like to move away from that. And I might have to ask you to repeat your question because I had another thought there and I think it's just floated out of my head.
That's right. So one was, as you mentioned, you know, what happens after this research, how do you present it? But I'm interested in your thoughts about how research influences reading in the general population.
Yes, absolutely. So that's what I was thinking. So I think in particular, we're hoping we can come away from this as well with a thing that we could almost show to publishers, to other authors, and say, these are the narratives. There is weight behind this. So in terms of if people are fearful to publish something with, say, less mainstream narratives that does have, you know, queer characters in it, has intersectionality in it, things that we haven't necessarily seen before in literature, and they know actually there is an inbuilt audience for this. There are people who are desperate to read this and would love to see more. So to potentially be able to bring it to those spaces as well, and even informing my own creative practice, which is probably a little selfish, but going, oh, okay, great. People do want to see stories about this, that, and the other. So I want to write them from where I am comfortable writing them too, though I will say in terms of, own voices, I'm only writing from certain aspects of my identity.
Terry, what is the opportunity for people who are writing from, say, a more mainstream gender, race, age, etc., socioeconomic status, all of those things? How can they respectfully incorporate more diverse characters and have a different representation in their stories without, I can't think of what it's the word is. It starts with A. Appropriating.
Yeah.
Without appropriating another person's story. And I think for me, thinking that I have grown up in Australia and for many years, but also knowing that some of the stories of the Indigenous Australians are part of my youth and understanding about some of the dreaming that they share with mainstream. And when does that become inappropriate for people to mention it? Where do we sit there? How do we respectfully do that?
I think there's a whole bunch of answers there, and it really depends on the individual, the way they're doing research, the way they're engaging with community, for instance. So are they bringing in sensitivity readers? Whose perspective are they writing from? And by that, I don't just mean protagonists, but are they writing from first person? Are they writing from third person? So for instance, one way I think that is a pretty nice straightforward way and that doesn't necessarily venture into appropriation is to incorporate this in your world. So you might have a main character who might be, for instance, white, because you're white and you're writing from that perspective, and that's probably the most respectful thing to do at that point, if that's the space you're in. But then to have other characters, and this isn't to say side characters or token characters, but imbuing them there. So you might have a character who's just generally referred to in the background, so my teacher, Ms. So-and-so, and her wife. Or you might be referring to characters who are non-binary and using those pronouns, but not making it necessarily a focal point. So that normalization, I think, can be really key in terms of not making a production, which is interesting because, I'm studying these queer texts. We're saying this is so important to see, but also saying, well, ideally, we want to be able to also see it where they're off having adventures, that like we've got a transgender character who's maybe fighting dragons and she gets to, save the world, that sort of thing. And it's just one of many parts of her identity. I've forgotten the original.
That's right.
No,
we're talking about, how can writers be respectfully in writing those characters in? And you've pointed out a few different ways to do that.
Oh, good. Yes. I think people are going to give different answers to that too, potentially based on context, based on positionality. I think it's potentially another simple way of going is I don't know if people should necessarily be writing from, say, first person or omniscient, all-knowing perspectives if they're writing from someone who's very far out of their own personal perspective. And the thing is, no one's literally standing there stopping you, but maybe it's that moment of pausing and saying, am I the right person to be writing this particular story or this particular character? Am I going to be causing harm to a community if I continue to do so, even if it's well-meaning, but still trying to do your best to incorporate that sense of, I suppose like real life diversity, so it doesn't become tokenistic in any way. And that's again where maybe if you're paying, say, a sensitivity reader or someone who's had that experience and can say to you, this is appropriate, this is inappropriate, and so on.
Excellent. Thanks, Annika.
No worries.
We've got lots of information there. Darren, have you got anything else we want to get from Annika while we're chatting with her?
Oh, look, already so much fuel for thought, but I just love the idea that she put forward about, our young adult demographic at the moment, that they will possibly play that big role in shifting our sense of identity. And just listening to what you were both just discussing then, and obviously it's something that is very important, because I'd hate to try and represent as a member of society or a member of culture even that and do it incorrectly, because that would just be that'd be bad. Full stop. But I'm sitting here thinking my crazy little whirlwind ways like I always do, but I'm thinking, well, potentially as a nation we're not going to be going overseas for at least a year, and even then I dare say it'll be longer just due to logistics, but it means we're going to be exploring our own backyard a lot more. And I'm just wondering if in a year, 2, 3 years, we're going to see the echo effect of that reflected in our literature, especially in our young adult literature, based on the fact that we do expand a little bit more and we do look into our own backyard a little bit more. And then maybe we go, and we see, I guess, familiar things that across, different cities and different states and between, urban centres and outback sort of style, your country towns. Hopefully that will also bring weight to seeing, not just seeing ourselves in literature, especially if you're, from a minority perspective in society, or you consider yourself minority, or whatever the correct way of saying it is. But maybe if by exploring our backyard a bit more, maybe you bump into other Aussies that, a whole lot just like you. And then you find yourself not only being represented in your own voice in literature, but maybe down, as we start to expand our wings of travel amongst this nation, maybe we'll start realizing that there's many people just like ourselves elsewhere in the country. And the two together, maybe mainstream becomes a tag for each and every single one of us. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, I love the possibility of that. I think that could really, and I think, as you say, us, well, not being trapped here, that sounds a bit too negative, but, we are essentially a little bit locked in. But yeah, be able to explore the world we're in, explore the country we're in particular, and do a bit more research on that and find out, who are your local custodians of the land, for instance, if you may not be familiar with it previously, and find out maybe even about your local stories and different identities that can exist in this space, and from that Australian perspective, rather than looking, let's say, overseas. So yeah, there's a lot more opportunity for it, I believe.
And not only that, I must say, Annika, there's another thing that's come through from the fantastic information you've given us today. It is that people are still loving to read books out there. And, to be honest, I wasn't sure about the young adult demographic and audience because of all of the things available out there as far as, instant entertainment and instant communication and technology. I'm myself a victim of it. I love it all as well. But just to know that people are still loving, picking up books and just diving into the beautiful worlds of stories is amazing. And I think every writer out there should be so happy to know that books aren't going anywhere, and our fantastic new generation coming up through Australia obviously have a appetite and passion for books, and that is just outstanding. And I love that you've been able to illuminate that a little bit better for everybody today.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think, what I really love, and I was actually just saying this at a virtual online conference, which is one of the nice things, I don't have to be traveling 24 hours to get to a conference these days. But, I do have to get up at 4 a.m. to attend, which is a slight downside. Yeah. But just saying how amazing the Australian publishing community and the community around it, not even publishing, the reading community for something like Love of Oz YA is just absolutely brilliant. You don't see it anywhere else, and I think it is because we are a smaller publishing industry for Australia. YA is huge worldwide, of course, as well, but even in Australia it's one of the major publishing industries, really. And it's just fantastic when you look at something that's just so driven by love and passion, as something like Love Oz YA is. That sort of movement we see online, and people coming together and always supporting Australian books it's phenomenal. It's brilliant to see, particularly because if we look at, the history of YA, it's still quite female dominated, actually, in terms of writers and in terms of readership. And that's largely because it's stemmed from its roots in children's literature, which was seen as not real literature. So women were allowed to write it, men were off doing more important things at the time. So it's sort of continued on, but I really love that as a subversive sort of space for it to grow from, and see just how powerful and just how empowering too it can be.
Fantastic. Annika, we have been talking to you about Seeing the Self, examining reader experience of queer representation in young adult literature. That's your current project. Where can people keep in touch with either you or your work online?
Oh, absolutely. So you can find me on Twitter. I cannot remember my Twitter handle. Might need to put that in your notes.
You are at Herb Annika.
Lovely. There we go. I learn something new every day. I'm particularly great with technology. So yeah, you can find me on Twitter. You can also always, if you are interested, I'm always happy to chat to people if they want to send me an email, send me a tweet, whatever. I would love to always chat more. And yeah, you'll see some more publications coming out in the academic space from me, but hopefully in some others, and let's say more like reader-wide accessible places as well. So not just the boring academic jargon.
Something tells me that we'll, in the future, we'll all remember this name very well, because no doubt it's going to become quite a powerful name in, publication and English literature world here in Australia. So, and I think your work is fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much. That's absolutely so lovely to hear. Thank you.
And thank you so much for being so generous with your time. We really appreciate you explaining all of the work and, giving us really the breadth of understanding that you have about the whole writing and researching in the university sector. So thank you very much.
No, absolutely. I think you've got a fantastic podcast going on here. So I'm looking forward to hearing more episodes and happy to be on anytime.
Excellent. We will have you down for a comeback when your research is a little bit further down the track. Thanks very much.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for your time today. You have a wonderful week ahead and a wonderful year ahead with your research, and definitely looking forward to seeing your name up in lights in that academic world. You take care.
Thanks. Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Veronica.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and bye for now.
Take care, everyone.
Let's meet again, where magic happens.
Australian Book Lovers acknowledges First Nations peoples and recognises their continuous connection to country, community and to culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and honour the sharing of traditional stories passed down through generations. We're committed to a safe and inclusive welcome for authors and readers of all cultures and backgrounds, including people of LGBTQIA+ communities and their families.